This is a different election. We need to keep the Senate. We need to take the House. We need to win the presidency. We need to send a message throughout the land and throughout the world, and we need to stand firm for our republic, or we're going to lose it.
This is where freedom rings.
If you believe in America, if you believe in the Constitution empowers us. It's a new day. America's back. America's back, and America's going to get strong again. We're going to defend America, and we're going to defend our interests.
Liberty's voice, Levin TV.
Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Levin TV. This is the most important Levin TV I have ever done in the 4.5 years that we've been doing this. Let me tell you a little story. We decided to do this, Levin TV, before we were even part of Conservative Review, before we were part of Blaze TV, just Levin TV at the time. We decided to do this, and I decided to do this because we're on a mission. And the mission is to save this republic, to advance the cause of this republic, to educate as many people as we can to the principles that undergird this society. Now, we knew, because we're a digital subscription operation, that our reach would be limited. But still, the reach can be far enough, as we have a significant number of members here, that the word can get passed from one to the other. And so, whether it's Levin TV, or my radio show, or Life, Liberty, and Levin, or my books, my goal is always the same: to expand the cause of human liberty, of individualism, of the principles in the Declaration and in the Constitution. So why is this the most important Levin TV that I've ever done? Because in a few days, people are going to vote. Many of you have already been voting, and many people apparently are going to vote after Election Day, but still Election Day is next Tuesday, November 3rd. 2020 will be remembered for 100 years, maybe 200 years. It is the election that determines the course of this republic. In fact, it's the election that determines whether we remain a republic. America is so unique and so special, sometimes we need to step back and think about it. The ideas that formulate this country were ideas that were generated for thousands of years. The Judeo-Christian principles and belief system, moving into the Reformation, moving into Western Enlightenment, all of these are part of what would become America. Now, how do we know this? Because the founders wrote about it. John Adams wrote extensively. Thomas Jefferson obviously wrote extensively. James Madison, Hamilton, they all were brilliant, they all wrote, they all spoke, and so we know what they relied on. And they talked about our Judeo-Christian belief system. They talked about Western Enlightenment. They talked about Athens and Rome. They talked about Britain and the best parts of the British parliamentary system, even though it was a monarchy. They read Locke. They read Montesquieu. They read Cicero and Plato and Aristotle in particular. They knew their contemporary, Adam Smith, Edmund Burke, for whom they had enormous respect. And so they pulled from these ideas, ancient and modern at the time, religious and non-religious. And they said, what kind of society can we create that does what? That respects individual human beings, and yet creates a society, a civil society in which they can function. The Declaration of Independence. How did this come to be? You know, the Revolutionary War, not officially, but actually broke out in New England well before 1776. And this is where names like Sam Adams and others are remembered by so many of you. And the battles that would take place in Boston, in the Boston Harbor. This is where you'll remember some of the great stories about Paul Revere, about the Battle of Lexington and Concord. This actually occurred before we had an official Declaration of Independence. And you know, many people outside of New England said, well, why do we need to go to war with Britain? First of all, it's a folly. It's the most powerful military on the face of the earth. Secondly, that's New England. Who cares what goes on in New England? Some of the southern states felt that way. Some of the mid-Atlantic states felt that way. But as the British kept tightening and tightening control over New England, they started to threaten other areas of the country, like Philadelphia. And it had an effect on the South as well. And so in the Second Continental Congress, they met in Philadelphia to try and debate the issue and figure out what to do. And delegates were sent from every state. And they went to Philadelphia and they met in the Pennsylvania Assembly House. And what's interesting about the Pennsylvania Assembly House is that's not only where the Declaration was ultimately agreed to and signed, but that's also where the Constitution would be drafted over a 5.5 month period in the summer of 1787. In any event, it was quite daunting. And all the states decided that they would, in fact, fight for independence against the British Crown. Now, they had to agree on a document. You see, the revolutionaries wanted to tell the whole world what they were doing. And so Jefferson was chosen by a committee. The committee included John Adams and Livingston, among others, to write the first draft. And he wrote the first draft. And among other things, he borrowed from John Locke. He borrowed from George Mason, who 4 to 5 weeks earlier had written the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And he came up with his draft of the Declaration. And it went through several iterations, and then finally came out as the one that you've seen. All the parts of the country came together and declared independence. And they had to sign this document. The signing of the document would be their death warrant. If the most powerful military on the face of the earth were to win this war, which was very likely, or to capture any of these men, they would execute them in some of the most horrible ways to set an example. And they signed them. And the great John Hancock, also Boston, he signed his name as big as he possibly could. And the others followed suit. And the Declaration of Independence was announced on July 4th, 1776. This began in earnest what would be the birth of the United States of America, not 1619, 1776. Now, this Declaration of Independence says in part, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Hence, the declaration to the whole world on what the people were doing, the colonists were doing. And then, famously, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed, will dictate the governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injustices and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And so war ensues. That war goes on for over 8 years. And of course, the commander of the forces is George Washington. George Washington loses almost every single battle that they're in. But he wins the battles he must. And there were times when he was down to a couple thousand troops. And I want you to keep something else in mind. The people, the colonists themselves, about a third of the colonists supported the war, about a third of the colonists did not support the war. And about a third of the colonists were basically undecided, much like happens in all the polling that goes on now in our country. In fact, in some of the cotton-producing southern states, they supported Britain because they made their money by selling cotton to the British. And they would become problematic because they would raise militia to fight the colonists who were fighting for independence. The vast majority of the deaths during the American Revolution occurred on the prison ships. The British were brutal. When they would capture militiamen or regular army, they put them on these massive ships where they would be feeding them rancid beef, if anything. They would get the worst kinds of illnesses. They had no treatment whatsoever, and these were basically death boats. They would live in their own feces. It was just horrific. And yet they fought on. They fought on. And so, to jump to the Constitutional Convention. This Constitutional Convention was really the second attempt to come up with a document. The first convention, such as it was, took place in Maryland, and all the states did not send delegates. And they tried to have some kind of a discussion about what this national government would look like. They were concerned about the Articles of Confederation because obviously the federal government, the national government, was utterly ineffective. And they were having a number of problems as a result of the Articles of Confederation. They had difficulty raising a military. They had difficulty putting national laws in place. They had difficulty financing, raising any monies whatsoever. And they had huge debt from the war. There were great problems in resolving disputes among and between the states, so it just wasn't working the way it needed to work. And so delegates were sent to Pennsylvania to fix the Articles of Confederation. As it turns out, they couldn't be fixed. So they started anew. And they came up with a document that represented, among other things, the thinking of Montesquieu. And the thinking of Montesquieu was based on 1,000 years of human experience. They had two concerns here. One was they didn't want a government centralized and powerful. They had dealt with a monopoly. They didn't want a dictatorship. On the other hand, they didn't want a mob. Around the same time of the American Revolution, you had the French Revolution. And what was taking place during the French Revolution was terror, blood in the streets, death for death's sake. The French Revolution differed from the American Revolution in that the French wanted to destroy the existing society, not just the governing system, but the existing society, because they thought it was unjust. The Americans never wanted to destroy their society. They were defending their society against what they believed was the monarchy, was the tyrannical monarchy. What they were fighting for was a just government and just laws to be applied equally. We come up with this Constitution, and I mentioned Montesquieu. He wasn't the only one, but he was very prominent. And Montesquieu argued that you need really 3 separate branches of government. He talked about the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. And so you balance the powers between these 3 entities, the legislative representing the people, the judiciary, which adjudicates dispute, and the executive, which executes in its simplest terms. And he felt that this way you can have a functioning government. but you protect yourselves against a centralized power, and you protect yourself against factions or the mob. So you don't have direct democracy. In our Constitution, Article 1 sets up Congress, Article 2, the presidency, the executive branch, and Article 3, we have the judiciary. So you have these three branches of government, but government's bigger than the branches themselves, and the Constitution addresses a number of issues. But the Constitution was not intended to address every aspect of life or the civil society. Why? Because the Constitution sets the limits on government, not the limits on the individual. The states still have their authority. The individual still has his power over himself and herself. So again, it's not intended to be a laundry list of every aspect of society to control it and manage it. That was not the idea. The idea was, what kind of government do we want? And we want the individual to be free within the context of this just and balanced government. That's the purpose of the Constitution. In terms of the Bill of Rights would come later. Why? Because arguments were made that it's impossible to list all the rights that belong to the individual vis-a-vis government. What happens if we leave some out? Then it might be viewed as something the government can control. Well, later it was decided, no, we need a Bill of Rights. It was decided that because a number of states, during the ratification process, would not ratify unless there were certain stated protections enshrined in the Constitution. They didn't want to start the constitutional process all over again. So what did they do? Well, they promised. John Adams promised, Madison promised, Hamilton promised that they would come after the fact, that they would amend the Constitution to provide for, they didn't call it a Bill of Rights, but these individual rights vis-a-vis the federal government. When the federal Congress met, the first time the federal Congress met, the first Congress, as they were doing their business, they pretty much ignored the promise that they had made to the states. But James Madison didn't forget, the father of the Constitution, and he asked the full House of Representatives to meet as a committee of whole and come up with these amendments to the Constitution, which they had borrowed mostly from the states originally. Well, they decided not to have a committee of the entire House, and they set up a committee to do exactly that, and Madison was in charge of that committee. They came up with 17 amendments. They sent them to the Senate whittled it down to 12, the House adopted the 12, and they sent them to the states. The states whittled it down to 10 absolutely crucial protections for the individual. The First Amendment, free speech, freedom of the press, crucial to a free society, freedom to exercise your religion. The government is to stay out of religious decisions. The right to associate, to assemble. These are things that were denied them under the Crown, and they viewed these as absolute human rights vis-a-vis the government. The Second Amendment, the right for the individual to bear arms and the right for the states to have a militia. That wasn't passive. They'd just gone through a war. They wrote the Declaration. They wanted the people to be armed, to protect themselves, to be honest with you, against tyranny. And they wanted the states to have the same power with the militia. You go through due process rights, equal protection rights, the takings clause that nobody ever talks about. If you're going to use somebody's property to make a road or to build a library or whatever it is, the person has a right to compensation for the market value of that property. And it goes on and on and on. Warrants, you must have probable cause, speedy trials. Couldn't have general warrants. You had to have specific warrants against an individual. Often ignored is the Ninth Amendment. I argue that the Ninth Amendment incorporates the Declaration of Independence. It's about individual liberty, the Ninth Amendment, which is probably why it is ignored by the courts. And of course, the crucial Federalism Amendment, which is the 10th Amendment, because they felt the power and all, ultimately should be with the states. And ultimately, that was the way it was supposed to work. Why am I walking you through this for the last half hour? This is your Declaration. This is your Constitution. They're not self-executing. They're not self-executing. if you believe in them and you revere them and you believe our country should adhere to them, it's up to you. These are documents. They don't do it on their own. We can't rely on politicians. We can't even rely on many of our fellow citizens anymore. The reliance is on you. We have sent men and women to war all over the world to protect these documents. Your liberty, your individualism, your property, your family, your way of life. We fought a civil war in this country. People say, oh, big deal, Civil War. We were a nation founded in 1619. These are all lies. We fought a civil war. And as we continue to calculate the casualties, because there were so many, it is now believed, not 600,000, not 700,000, that there were 850,000 casualties. Almost 500,000 men lost their lives fighting to keep this union and to end slavery. Today, that would be 5 to 6 million men over a 4.5 year period. Think about that. It affected every aspect, every family in this country, and of course the future of the nation. What were they fighting for? This. Abraham Lincoln would constantly refer to the Declaration. He did the Constitution, but the Declaration for moral authority. Remember, the Declaration lays out the principles of this country. The Constitution lays out the supreme law of the land. And he would refer repeatedly to the Declaration of Independence over and over and over again. But something happened in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Karl Marx had become very popular about a half a century before throughout Europe, particularly Germany and Britain. But his ideology began to spread. The more he wrote, it was considered an international ideology. It wasn't enough for one area or one state or one country to embrace what would be called communism. But it was an international movement. This began to bleed into American intellectual and social circles among academics and elites and intellectuals. And in America, it became known as the progressive movement. The progressive movement. I call it the progeny of the Marxist movement. It's an Americanization of Marxism. And it's not by accident that some of the early intellectuals who promoted progressivism would later become very fond of the Russian Revolution. Some of them even embraced early on Stalin. But this whole idea, this whole concept began to bleed into the American system. And there were several leading intellectuals. One of them would be Woodrow Wilson. Before Woodrow Wilson was president of Princeton, before he was governor of New Jersey, obviously before he was president of the United States, he would write a lot as a scholar and an intellectual. And what did he attack? Well, he attacked the Constitution, the governing system, but he attacked the Declaration of Independence. I wrote about this in Rediscovering Americanism. Why did he attack the Declaration of Independence? Because he said the first part that I read to you is fine. It's the second part we need to focus on. All the issues that the colonists had with the crown. He said that was a declaration for the time, for 1776. It's not a declaration for now, 1900, 1918, 1905, 1890, whatever. We're a different country. We're a different people. And we have a right to make our own declarations of needs and rights to our own government and our own society. So while that's a very interesting document, the Declaration of Independence, it doesn't have a hell of a lot to do with what goes on today. All this talk about unalienable rights and natural law, he said, that's all swell, but it's meaningless. That's just fodder for revolutionaries. But that doesn't really apply to today, and he wasn't the only one who argued that. But why? Because he wanted you to look at society and governing differently. You see, he borrowed from Rousseau and Hegel and certainly Marx, all three of which believed and wrote as the progressive does today. What's this individual stuff? What's this free will stuff? You're part of something bigger. We need to look at the communal, that is the community. We need to look at the general will. We need to look at the general good. And for self-realization, for the individual to have self-realization and fulfillment, they need to basically surrender their individual motivations, their individual desires, their material interests. They need to surrender it to the state. First to a movement, the progressive movement, then to the state. And this is how the state will become more just, the state will be more reflective of what individuals and the collective as an aggregate want. So the point is to devour the individual and devour the individual's unique identity. And they have to attack success. What else do they have to attack? The Constitution. Why? Progressives have to attack the Constitution because the Constitution limits the power of government. It divides it, creates checks. It gives specific powers to each part. It talks about the 9th and the 10th Amendment, individual rights and state sovereignty. It was Woodrow Wilson who came up with the line, and I paraphrase that, we have a living and breathing Constitution. And he explains what he means. He says, a human body can't work when organs are divided against the body and divided against themselves, competing. So the government and the country is much like the human body. It's living and breathing. And so all these parts need to work together, not fight with each other, not check each other, not balance each other, but they need to function together. So he's the one that coined the living and breathing Constitution. What he meant by that is kill the Constitution. And so he also argued that the Constitution, the way it is set up, makes progress almost impossible, makes modernity almost impossible. So what did he say? Among other things, he wrote that the judiciary is key. Keep in mind, the judiciary is not elected. These are lifetime appointments. He says the judiciary is key, the control of the judiciary is key, because through the judiciary, the so-called referees, we can control outcomes, what the legislature does, what the presidency does, what the states do. So it's crucial to control the judiciary. Now, what does that mean? That means the judiciary is, in communist terms, really a political Politburo that needs to reflect the power of the state. The power of the state. You see the fights going on over the judiciary? You see Schumer and the Democrats, why they fight over the judiciary? Because they've known for over 100 years that's where the action is. You see the fight over the Supreme Court? They're not kidding. And if they can't get their way on the Supreme Court, they will expand it and they will pack it. Why? Well, Woodrow Wilson tells you why. Because in the end, these referees need to impose their will. And what is their will? It needs to be the will of the progressive. And when you look at the past 100 years, particularly the last 80 years, you see that in court decisions, whether it is so-called climate change, whether it's regulation, whether it's Obamacare, whatever it is. The courts are involved in many, many areas that the founders and the framers never intended, but which the progressives always demanded. Always demanded. What else do they do? Well, as they centralize the power of government more and more to socially engineer we the people, because remember, this is ultimately a philosophy or ideology that finds its roots in Marxism, they need to talk about their tyranny and their centralization of government in the context of the popular will and the people. And this is the difficulty a lot of people have. It seems contradictory. It's contradictory as a matter of logic, but it's not contradictory as a matter of propaganda. So the more centralized, the more of a police state you create, the more they argue that they're doing the people's will. And the people have to surrender. Remember what I said earlier? They have to surrender more and more of their liberty, more and more of their property to the state. So what do you see? This. What in the world is this? I mean, the Declaration and Constitution fit in this. What in the world is this? This is the 110-page Biden-Sanders, I call it, modern-day Communist Manifesto, which gets into every part of our culture and our society, which will affect every walk of life, including each and every one of you. From healthcare to energy to immigration to the economy and on and on. This document tells you what they intend to do to you, to the culture, and to the country. You know what they intend to do? Burn this. They intend to burn the Declaration and the Constitution. You know how often individual liberty is mentioned in this document? Not once. Free market capitalism, property rights, they're only mentioned in the context of attacking them and destroying them. Think about what taxes are. This is filled with massive tax increases. Increase massively the personal federal income tax, increase massively the corporate income tax, increase massively the capital gains tax, increase massively the death tax, farmers and so forth who want to pass their property. Keep in mind what labor is. Labor is the physical and intellectual time that you spend working. And you spend most of your life working. And so when you work and you earn something, you know, back in the old days, prior to currency and everything, you work for food, you work for land, you work for protection. Today we have currency, obviously. When you work for something, if somebody takes 20%, 30%, or 40% of it, you're giving away 20, 30, 40% of your life's work. Of your life's work. And so taxation should be something that's done with the greatest of care, but it's not. Under this document, depending on where people live, some of our fellow Americans are going to be paying over 60% in taxes to their state, local, and federal government. That's unbelievable. What do you think the revolutionaries would say about that? They're going to control what kind of materials you use in your house. They're going to control carbon dioxide. They call it carbon pollution, but carbon dioxide is not pollution. That's carbon dioxide. If we had plants, they'd be inhaling it to create oxygen. I think we learned that in the third grade science class, didn't we? So carbon dioxide, unlike monoxide, is not a pollutant, but they want to control it. They want to control the atmosphere. They believe they can control the atmosphere. They call that greenhouse gases. Ladies and gentlemen, without greenhouse gases, we're dead. Greenhouse. Some of us who live in the north or colder areas, in the winter you drive and you'll see greenhouses. What are in greenhouses? Plants. That's how terrible greenhouse. It's the atmosphere recreated in a greenhouse. There's nothing wrong with greenhouses. There's nothing wrong with the atmosphere. And there's nothing we can do about it anyway. So all throughout this document, it's an attack on the way we live. It's socialism. It's centralism. It's anti-classical liberalism. It is completely alien to the Declaration and the Constitution. If they're elected, we will live by this document, not by these documents. These documents, all the blood, all the fighting, carrying our flag into the wars, all that our ancestors have done, all that men and women surrounding us today, veterans, have done to protect this document, will be for naught. Because we won't live under these documents anymore. We'll live under this document. And they've already told us they're going to change the Supreme Court. They're going to change the Supreme Court. Franklin Roosevelt tried to change the Supreme Court, and his own party put him down. His party won't put Biden down this time. So they're going to basically burn down the institution of the Supreme Court. They want to destroy the United States Senate by simply adding 2 areas, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. That's 4 Democrat senators who will be Democrat senators forever. Think about this as a footnote. You can't just add the District of Columbia. Our Constitution breaks out the District of Columbia as a federal enclave. But they plan to do it anyway. They plan to do it anyway. So that would be 4 Democrat senators. That would mean the Republicans really would probably never have a chance to regain the majority there. They want to get rid of the filibuster rule. And the filibuster rule is not in the Constitution, but it's been used by the Senate since almost the beginning of the Republic. Why? Remember what I said. They were opposed to a parliament. They were opposed to direct democracy. They were opposed to mob rule. In the original writings of the Constitution, the only body that's directly elected is the House of Representatives. The senators were chosen by the state legislatures. Not even the governors were involved. So that was changed with the 17th Amendment. So now we have the direct election of senators. I think a big mistake. But they will destroy the Senate, and they basically want to destroy the Senate. They believe they can hold the House for most of the rest of the century. They can get rid of the filibuster rule. They will pass whatever legislation they want if they have a Democrat president. They will be able to change the Supreme Court, and then their aims are going to be the Electoral College. What does that mean? Why? Let's make it simple. The Electoral College was necessary or there wouldn't be a constitution. Why? Because some areas of the country are heavily populated. Some areas of the country are not. For instance, the areas of the country that actually grow our food and provide it for us, they're not heavily populated. The areas of the country that actually drill for natural gas and oil and actually provide it to us so we can function, they're not heavily populated. And so those areas of the country need representation as well. Maybe not because of the numbers of people who live there, but because of what they do. They are providers more than users. In the cities, we have more users than providers when it comes to food and natural gas and so forth. And so it was a way of uniting the country to make sure the country wouldn't unravel. It was a way of making sure cities wouldn't control what we now call suburbs, and back then farmers and rural areas. It was a way of trying to ensure peace and tranquility in the nation, because the small states and the less populated states were never going to join the Union and be lorded over by New York and back then Philadelphia and so forth. If we get rid of the Electoral College, that's exactly what will happen. The heavily populated areas of the country, the heavily populated areas within states, will control what happens in the rest of the country. Okay, so you're not a country anymore. So that is a huge problem. But keep in mind what's intended here. To control the Supreme Court, ideologically, to fundamentally alter the United States Senate, so it's more, the Congress is more like a parliament, a Democrat Party parliament, to destroy the legislative making process so they can ram through whatever they want, and then to have power through the electorate forever. So have power through the courts forever, power in the Senate forever, and power through the election process forever. You know what we call that? Tyranny. You know what we call that mindset? Totalitarianism. The Democrat Party has become the vessel through which tyranny is being exercised. This document right here. The candidate through which the Democrat Party intends to achieve these things is Joe Biden, who is really a very nasty and incompetent individual, as his entire public career has demonstrated. He is a figurehead. Kamala Harris, being the most radical member of the United States Senate, even with others who are truly radical, she is the most radical. Why do you think she is his running mate? This is very, very serious times we live in. Now, voting is not just, oh, I'm going to vote. Voting for the presidential election is a binary choice, one or the other. And this choice is very, very easy because Donald Trump embraces our Constitution. He embraces our principles. He loves this country. He's not looking for ways to fundamentally transform it, and this is one of the reasons he's so hated and despised. Not because of tweets, not because of the way he talks. They were going after Donald Trump during the election, when the man barely came down the escalator. They were spying on his campaign. They were trying to remove him from office in a coup, criminal investigations based on no predicate, then a phony impeachment. And now, of course, the effort to defame and destroy him as we all vote and get ready to vote. He is the only candidate that stands between us and those of us who love this and them, those who do not. This is a different election. We need to keep the Senate. We need to take the House. We need to win the presidency. We need to send a message throughout the land and throughout the world, and we need to stand firm for our republic, or we're going to lose it.